Hi there, and thank you for joining Change I Am Possible, India's first futuretech podcast. Do kindly subscribe, support, and share. US, China, and Europe are leading when it comes to quantum computing research, funding, and development because they understand the potential of quantum computing and what it can do to mankind once the technology matures. The Finance Minister Nirmala Sitaram has announced a budget of 8,000 crores towards building quantum technologies and applications. I spoke with Vijay Raghavan, who's the Associate Professor of Physics at the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, which is India's first superconducting quantum computing lab. He leads the experimental quantum computing effort. The potential of a working quantum computer is unfathomable. I personally am super excited for India's first quantum computer. I wish you enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you, Vijay, for doing this and joining Change I Am Possible podcast. Really appreciate, and I'm really excited to talk about quantum computing today. It's the topic which has baffled everyone, right? I mean, classical computing is simple because it computes with binary codes, which is yes and no. But when it comes to quantum computing or quantum physics, everything goes bonkers, because with quantum computing, you're going to start computing with the fundamental code of what we are all made of, atoms, right? And atoms have a history which goes into that little woo-woo zone. Especially quantum computing, quantum physics has this something called a superposition, where it gets extremely confusing. Unlike binary or classical computing, it's very clear. It's either zeros and one. With quantum computing, this could be here, this could be there, and a superposition it could be a zero, it could be a one, it could be a one or zero. And with entanglement, again, it goes bonkers. I mean, something that you change over here, its twin could also get affected and stuff like that. So please explain what is quantum computing in layman's term, please.
Sure, Eddie. Thanks a lot for having me here. And yes, it's actually a very exciting technology. And unfortunately, yes, it's very confusing. Mm-hmm. And I think in the initial discussion, you said, let's explain this to the layman. I'll try my best. But beyond a point, I also enter the same category as a layman is. And you don't understand things beyond a certain level. But as you correctly said, the essential idea of computing, which is what we now call classical computing, which again actually is a strange name. It is called classical computing just because you now have something called quantum computing, just like we call classical mechanics as the thing which was before quantum mechanics. And it's based on this essential idea that you can use binary code, which is basically zeros and ones, any two-state system. So two properties, as you are also saying, yes and no, to represent information. So then by using a combination of these zeros and ones, you can represent larger amount of information. And then you have to apply logic. So, the storage part is one, that's just the memory where you're storing information. And then you have the logic, which is like, if you're talking about very simple logic like addition, subtraction, multiplication. And that by combining these things, you can do more and more complex computation. And of course, this technology is extremely successful. I mean, the fact that we are recording this on a digital camera and everything is digital, it all works on classical computing. So it's extremely powerful, but it turns out that there are certain things classical computing is not very efficient at doing. And this one particular example is actually modeling nature, because nature at the most fundamental level follows the laws of quantum mechanics. Right. And as you correctly said, there is this idea of superposition, where things can be in multiple places at the same time, or things can be in multiple states at the same time. And it's this aspect of superposition which is really key to basically make the difference between the classical computer and a quantum computer. And you have to remember that all of these systems, whether it's classical or quantum, they require some physical system to store it. Like for classical information, you can store the information on a hard drive, on a CD, DVD, or a flash drive, or the state of the transistors inside your computer, which represent the bits. Similarly, you need some physical systems which also store the state of a quantum bit. The only difference now is that this physical system follows the laws of quantum mechanics, and hence allows for the possibility of a superposition. So which could mean that the same physical system will have one particular state for 0 and another particular state for 1. So till now, there is no difference between a classical and a quantum bit. But now in the quantum system, you can also prepare the system in what we call as the superposition state. And the confusing or the unfortunate part comes from the fact that in plain language, we say it's both 0 and 1 at the same time.
Right.
Mathematically, a very precise way of writing it down. We understand what it means. But in the plain language, that's basically what you can say, that it's in both 0 and 1 at the same time. So if you now have 2 bits, in classical computer, you can create 0, 0, 0, 1, 1, 0, and 1, 1. But in a quantum computer, all of those 4 possibilities can be present at the same time.
Right.
And you can keep going, and that's where the power starts to show up, is that when you go to a large number of bits, qubits, then the number of possibilities grows as 2 to the power n. And as we were discussing earlier, by the time you reach even a very modest number like 300 qubits, the number of different possibilities is roughly of the order of the number of atoms in the entire universe.
Right.
And it's not just that fact. It's the fact that you can prepare that 300 qubit system in a combination of all of those states at the same time. And it's this ability to play with this very large space. So in the jargon, we call it the Hilbert space, is what gives the power to a quantum computer.
Right.
And because laws of nature follow quantum mechanics, it becomes extremely hard to simulate that on a classical computer, but a quantum computer will be able to do it more efficiently because it follows the same rules.
Right.
So that's my layman's spiel of
Lovely.
what a quantum computer is, but it still really doesn't answer many questions of but how exactly it works. And that's actually a very hard question even for experts.
Right.
Like my own focus is on the building of the hardware itself, but to exploit this aspect and turn it into a realistic algorithm for solving a particular problem is a fairly non-trivial problem.
Right.
And there are only like handful of people in the entire world who really work on this. And it really requires a different level of thinking. A good programmer doing classical code need not necessarily be able to do good programming for quantum computing.
Right, completely. I think you need to understand quantum physics to understand quantum computing, right? When Neil Bose came and told him about quantum computing, so he was also
Quantum mechanics.
Yeah, quantum mechanics, and he said, this is not possible, and does that mean that the moon does not exist? And talk a little bit about the double slit experiment, because right from the beginning, I mean, that's been so people say, if you have you do the double slit experiment, a conscious observer creates or manifests reality. So what are your views on that?
So let me actually take some of these things separately. The question of the double slit experiment connecting with quantum mechanics and connecting with this idea of a conscious observer, they're related but slightly different things. Okay. The double slit experiment itself actually has been known for much longer before even quantum mechanics. In fact, it was an experiment for proving the wave nature of any in any system. So the early experiments were done with light, and at that time, light was considered to be a wave. And the double slit experiment just says that it's an interference phenomena where the waves passing through to the two slits, they recombine, and then depending on where they are recombining, they can either combine in such a way that the overall wave amplitude increases, or they recombine in such a way that the overall wave amplitude decreases. I mean, as someone in the sound space, you understand interference very it's part and parcel of all wave phenomena. So even in sound, if you think about your noise cancelling headphones, that's basically what they do. They try to find out the exact opposite of the noise which you're getting and try to cancel that, right? So the Young's double slit experiment by itself is not deeply rooted in quantum mechanics in that sense. It's just a wave phenomena. The problem or the interesting thing happens when you try to do this experiment in the so-called quantum regime, right? We now understand that light is actually composed of individual particles, which we call photons or particles of light. And what happens if you do this experiment where you send in only one particle at a time, rather than the normal case where we just send a lot of light?
Right.
And these particles of light have extremely tiny amount of energy. So, right now there is billions and billions of photons just bouncing around this room. And usually when you do the experiment, there are lots and lots of photons that you don't worry about the fact that there's actually these single particles, right? But when you go and you say that I'm going to send one particle, and the double slit experiment means that you have a particle here of light which is traveling towards a screen. There are two slits. It has to cross that. And then there is a screen on this side.
Right.
And it's basically the pattern which is formed on that screen which tells you that interference has taken place or not. So you get this, alternately bright and dark patches, which tells you that you have the interference. But the tricky part comes in is that when you say, what is that single photon doing? Is it, when it passes through, does it go through one slit? Does it go through the other slit? Or does it go through both slits, which is what we sort of invoke to understand the quantum phenomena. And then if it goes through both slits, it's almost like it's interfering with itself. And then it's forming that pattern. How does it know where to go? The even more bizarre thing is that how do you even detect a single particle of light? You can make some special photographic film which is maybe sensitive to one particular light. And how does that one do that experiment? You send in one photon, it goes through this system and then creates a little dot on the screen.
Right.
So what has happened? Nothing. There's no interference pattern right now. It's just one dot. So the interference pattern comes when you send in many such, but one at a time.
Right.
But somehow the photons know that they have to distribute themselves on the screen so as to recreate the exact same interference pattern.
That's the weird part.
That's the weird part. That how does an individual photon know?
Right.
And the way we explain is that it's really going through both the slits, and there's actually a wave function which basically that's the main element of the quantum theory, is that there is a wave function which describes the photon, and that wave function is actually going through both the slits, and then it determines a probability distribution. And this is the second aspect, that all of the things are random. And in fact, that's exactly what happens when you send these photons one at a time. They seem to randomly appear on different parts of the screen. But over a long time, when you have sent enough photons that you can actually start seeing the film develop, and you see this pattern emerging, it looks exactly like the interference pattern. So there are certain points where the photons won't go at all.
Right.
Those are the dark patches. And there are certain points where they will go a lot. These are the bright patches. And what determines this is the spacing between the slits, the size of the slits, how far the screen is. This all goes into solving the quantum mechanical equation. And what it predicts is the interference pattern.
Right.
We just don't know what will happen in a single instance. And that's the random part. And that's sort of the confusing part.
Exactly.
But this is unfortunately, how nature works. And I don't think there's anybody's come up with a convincing answer of why it behaves like that.
Yes.
But the answer is we know how to calculate, and it follows it.
You are, I believe, one of the first guys in India who's working on a quantum computer, right? At TIFR.
Right.
So can you share some more details on that?
Sure. So, I started my group about now 7 years ago. It'll be 7 years next month. And we were the first group to work on in India on this technology of using superconducting electronic circuits to build a quantum computer. There have been previous efforts on another technology called NMR. And now there are several other people who are starting to work. So, as I was saying earlier, you need some physical system where you can prepare this quantum states, right? And one of the natural ways of doing it would be to use individual atoms. And as I was saying, I think before we started the recording, that there are these systems where individual atoms can be trapped,
right?
And you can manipulate the states. Basically, these are how the electrons are present in the atom, right? And those are extremely microscopic. We're talking about single atoms. But it turns out that nothing prevents you from making systems which are much bigger than a single atom and yet show the same quantum mechanical property of superposition.
Right.
So the devices we make, they are electronic circuits in the sense that they are similar to the kind of chips we have in our conventional electronic circuits. The difference is that they use a superconducting material. Now, I'm sure a lot of people know what a superconductor is, but it's basically a metal which can transmit electricity without any dissipation, so no resistance.
Right.
And usually this happens at very, very low temperatures. So the material we use is aluminum, and we deposit aluminum on a chip in different patterns, and the pattern sort of determines the functionality. And a single circuit like that we design is usually of the size of maybe less than a millimeter, but you can almost see it with the naked eye. And yet, when it's cooled down to very, very low temperatures, and now these are extremely low temperatures, colder than outer space.
Right.
We call it, temperature is
Kelvin.
10 millikelvin, actually, which is close to minus 273 degrees centigrade, or very close to absolute zero. And there are commercial machines which allow you to cool just a fridge, a special kind of a fridge. You put it in and it cools down. At those temperatures, the superconducting properties emerge, and then these systems behave like a quantum bit. In the case of atoms, as I was telling you, it's basically the state 0 and state 1 correspond to the in which orbital the electron is, which electron, the electrons go around these atoms in certain orbitals. In our case, the qubits are basically oscillators. It's like a bell, but an electrical bell, the kind you actually even have in your cell phones and other high frequency equipment. And the 0 and 1 correspond to this oscillator not doing anything, so it has no energy, versus it having the minimum amount of energy which is allowed by quantum mechanics, which is basically 1 quanta of energy. It's these two different possible states which represent the 0 and the 1. So we have, a couple of years back demonstrated just a 3-qubit quantum processor, which works on a slightly different design. It's a unique design which we came up with here. It has some advantages, some disadvantages, but we showed that for certain problems it seems to work quite well. And currently we are working on scaling that up to make more number of qubits. So we have a 3-qubit system. We're going to combine it with another 3-qubit system to create a 6-qubit system and make larger and larger processors. Because a quantum computer is actually only powerful when the number of qubits are sufficiently large. This 2 to the n has to become large enough that no other conventional computer can actually do anything with it. So currently that's sort of the stage at which we are. Internationally, in this superconducting technology is one of the most promising ones and currently at the forefront. You must have seen in the news about Google and IBM. Both of them use the same superconducting device technology operating at very low temperatures using these aluminum thin film devices on a chip. And I think currently the largest processor is which was announced was a 72-qubit one by Google a couple of years ago. But the most recent result they put out a month back is a system with 53 qubits. So that's sort of the size scale of these chips which people are making right now.
So when you mentioned that you have like a 3-qubit quantum computing which you're working on, you're going to double it to 6-qubit. So what would a 6-qubit be able to output? What would be the use case at this point in time?
So that's a good question. Currently, absolutely nothing. It's a technology demonstration. Just like 3-4 years ago, IBM launched a 5-qubit quantum computer, which actually they still have several of them, which you can access freely from the cloud. So you can write a program and it goes and runs on that machine and comes back. Okay. The reason which I say that they are not very useful in terms of a practical application is that at the level of 5, 7, maybe even 10 qubits, you can actually simulate the behavior of that computer on a regular classical computer. And in fact, you can do it perfectly. These machines currently are in a situation where they are not really perfect. They actually make errors all the time. Every once in a while, they will give you a wrong answer and you have to sort of redo the calculation again. But you can simulate them on a classical computer efficiently at this level. It's only when you get to the level of 50 qubits that it becomes very hard. I think anything up to 20 qubits, you can do it on a conventional computer. Beyond that, you're going to need supercomputers to simulate the behavior. And once you cross the 50-100 threshold, basically no computer in the world will be able to do what that quantum computer can do. But you have to start somewhere. Unless you know how to build a 3-qubit processor, you cannot build a 50-qubit processor. So you learn what the problems are. You understand the essential properties of your system. You understand the challenges in building the circuitry. There's a lot of conventional electronics which goes into this because, ultimately a quantum computer will be like, maybe 0.01% quantum and everything else will be conventional electronics because there's a lot of control. And remember that as humans and users, we only communicate in classical language. So it cannot be a quantum all the way. So we have to send the inputs in a classical fashion and the outputs have to be classical. And somewhere deep down in that process, the quantum processor takes over and does its thing and then again communicates back. So that's sort of the stage we are at, trying to understand the basic building blocks. We're trying to come up with new ideas to see if the current approaches can be improved so that you can actually go to larger number of processors without the errors which are currently present.
So you mentioned that you spent somewhere around 7 years. You'll complete 7 years next month,
TIFR,
right?
Yes.
And I'm sure it must have been tough because this is something so new. And back then, maybe 7 years when you started, I mean, maybe hardly anybody knew about this technology. Now people know about this because media is becoming big, and people know about this quantum computing largely because of the woo-woo factor. Because you put on YouTube and suddenly you go, oh, quantum computing, and this is going to be this is going to revolutionize or transform mankind because of its computing power. Because all that you hear is going to be millions or trillion times faster than a classical computer. So tell me, right now I'm sure you must have faced lots of challenges, right? And you're passionate about it, and you want to build a quantum computing which will be functional and commercial. What's the time period do you see, and and from 6, where would you jump? From 6-qubit, and how long would it take?
Right. So these are good questions with not so easy answers.
Right.
The time scale on building something like this, especially as you go to larger number of qubits, depends on many factors: funding,
Right.
resources, and the right team of people. Now, when I started 7 years ago in India, it was new in the Indian context that nobody else was working in this area. But internationally, I mean, my entire training, both PhD and postdoc, was in this field. So I had the right training since 2001. When I started my PhD, that this field was just sort of emerging
Right.
and picking up. So I'm talking about the superconducting technology. So I had the right skill set to come and start this effort here, but you needed a lot of money to get started. So one of the challenges is that just to get started in a basic lab, forget about a commercial venture, you need something like $1 million, right? And at least historically, providing this kind of funding to beginners in the Indian context has been difficult. But things have actually been quite good, I would say, in the last 10, 15 years. The amount of funding has increased, but still the number of places in India, we're talking about academic research institute. Remember, when I joined TIFR, even though my research was in quantum computing, it wasn't very clear whether we will be entering an arena where we're going to start building larger and larger systems very soon. That would have depended on the ecosystem which was going to emerge in the Indian context. And that's now starting to happen. The government has recognized that this is an important area, and new programs are being initiated to take this to the next level. So the time scale would really depend on how much funding is coming from. And I think initially it has to come from government sources. Right. And then as private players start seeing a commercial way to exploit this, they will start coming in. So, currently there are 3 people in the country who work in the superconducting technology. There are 2 people in Bangalore, and we are all just getting started. But we can accelerate very quickly once we solve the challenges of, going from 1 to 3 can be very hard. Right. 3 to 10, maybe not so much. And then beyond the 10, it will get easier because you have understood the elementary parts, but it still requires immense amount of resources and funding. And if those things happen in a smooth way, then we are sort of thinking of having a 50 to 100 qubit kind of system. I think in 5 to 10 years is not unthinkable. And here again, one says that, IBM has a 50 qubit computer now.
Yeah, right.
They have been working on it for 10 years, even more. So, there's no reason to say that we can skip that step. Right. Yes, we can go a little faster, but the resources have to be in place.
Right. Yeah. Somehow, if you see, when it's transformational technologies, I guess the Western countries have actually picked it up, or always picked it up fast, right? So right now, USA is leading. US is leading with quantum computing. China is leading. China is doing a whole lot of stuff. North America, especially, is doing great. So, do you think that it's the risk-averse nature of our investors, which is the problem, the reason why we do not have a global tech company coming out of India? Because, you have the talent over here, right? Why are we 5 years behind? When we know that, I think these 2 technologies which is going to redefine or transform humanity is artificial intelligence and quantum computing. Why do you think that's the case? And why do you think there is no international companies, tech companies?
Well, very good questions, again, with very difficult answers. I think the Indian context, you have to keep many things in mind. You have to realize that when the early research happened in quantum computing, they were not thinking about quantum computing. It was basic research. out of curiosity. You wanted to understand, can we control quantum systems at the individual, single atom level, right? And this kind of research was happening 30 years ago, 40 years ago in various labs, mostly in the US. Again, because the infrastructure requirements and the funding requirements for those kind of experiments is very high. And traditionally in the past, getting very large amount of funding for experimental research has been tricky. India has been good at some of the big science stuff where it's an international effort. We participate in the in these particle accelerators and things like that, but there's a lot of money going in. But that tradition has been missing, of starting to do very exploratory research in areas which can have a lot of technology potential. And the important thing again is that you never know which particular area will actually have technology potential. So in that sense, the Indian scene actually has been good, because at least out of the places I've seen around the world, we don't really restrict people from doing any research they want.
Yeah.
But if the resources did not exist, for example, there was no way I could even get started if they had not given me, the kind of money which was required. There's no clever hack. There's no jugaad to get to minus 273 degrees centigrade, right? So, and that machine costs $500,000.
Wow.
So what do you do about that?
Right.
So you need the investment in place. You also need people who have been working in this area. So I spent all my PhD and postdoctoral training abroad. So I was working in this area. And then my question was, well, can I set up a lab in India where the resources are going to be provided? And, the answer turned out to be yes. And I started work on this. So to go from basic research where you don't even know where this is going to identifying that this has technological implications, to then bringing in a larger scale of research, bringing in the investors, is a long process. And I think at each of these stages, historically, we have been not so good at it. Things are changing now, but then things cannot, just because of that, it cannot change overnight.
Right.
So I think it's important that even if we are slightly late into the game, to do it now correctly, so that the next big thing, we are actually in the game right at the beginning. And this is something I often hear. People always say, hey, we are already late, then what's the point? We're going to miss the boat. But with quantum computing, my own personal feeling is that we are probably still not late. Okay, and there are certain aspects of the quantum technology which have strategic importance. In that case, you might not even be able to buy this technology, whatever money you're willing to pay, at some later stage. So then you need a way to do this in-house. It will take time. It will take a sustained amount of effort. You have to do all the right things, give money, bring in the right people, do the planning properly. And then, it will show the benefits in 5 to 10 years.
So quantum computing is supposed to be transformational. It promises to change the dynamics of how we live, right? So there is this thing that it is going to possibly capture carbon out of thin air. It could simulate various things. The stock market could be simulated. What happens to the finance industry when something like that happens? And protein building is another space. So these are possibly very far-fetched things. I'm sure quantum computing can do that when it matures. But with a 53 qubit quantum computing, which exists at this point in time, like an IBM or a Google, what are the things that it can do presently, and what would it be able to do in the near future?
Sure. So let's consider two different aspects. One, as I mentioned, is that the quantum computer gets really powerful only when the number of qubits are large. Okay, and currently we are at roughly the 50, and 50 is sort of roughly the break-even point where a classical computer is no longer able to simulate it.
Right.
Otherwise, anything smaller than that, you don't need a quantum computer. You can get the same results what a quantum computer can do on a regular computer. Right. The second thing to remember, as I was mentioning earlier, is that the current generation of quantum computers are prone to errors.
Right.
Now, imagine a situation, 50 years ago, 60 years ago, where I tried to come and sell you a calculator, right? And I said, it's a very good calculator. It works. It'll help you to add numbers. But every once in a while, you type 3 plus 5 and it'll say 6. Okay, please ignore it and then keep carrying on. That is really the situation. It sounds comical, but that's really the situation of the current state of the quantum computers. And this is because the quantum systems are themselves very fragile. And they currently don't use a particular piece of technology called quantum error correction. That essentially makes sure that even if your quantum bits are unstable and they're sort of doing some random things once in a while, your information is not lost and your calculation will not go wrong. Quantum error correction is currently not implemented in any of the processes which are available. Okay. So what that means is that these computers will make errors, will give you wrong answers once in a while, but they are still probably more powerful than what a corresponding classical computer would do. Now, I don't know the details of the architecture and the properties of, say, what the IBM and the Google machine is, to be able to say that, okay, no, this will be able to solve this particular problem, but not that particular problem, because this problem is less tolerant to the errors and that problem is more tolerant to the others. But some of the early applications are going to be, I think, in chemistry, in the sense that chemical reactions involve atoms and electrons. Those follows the laws of quantum mechanics. And you can do certain calculations concerning chemistry, and this is already happening at a very small level. A few years back, again, on the IBM machine, and even on, I think, the Google group also did this. They calculated properties of very simple molecules like hydrogen and lithium hydride. So very simple molecules. By the time you come to something like a caffeine molecule, or an aspirin medicine, it already gets very complicated, and you're going to need more and more number of qubits. But this is probably an arena where the early stage quantum computers, which are still error prone, and they're going to try to make it better, but without error correction, you might be able to make some impact, where a certain computation which might be very hard to do on a classical computer can be done on a quantum computer. But this is also probably one of the most promising areas. Modeling nature basically means that I can understand the functioning of anything out there.
Right.
Chemical reactions. And then the moment you said that, chemistry, it means like new materials, better energy storage. A quantum computer itself is not going to capture the carbon. It will probably tell you how to do it correctly, right? So it's only a calculation. But it basically tells you, and the thing is, people are often saying that, you can get motivated from nature because nature actually does this in many scenarios. If you can understand that and model it on a quantum computer, maybe it'll tell you how to actually do it efficiently in a machine. So that's, I think, and this is actually one of the original applications which was imagined by all the way back to Feynman, where he said that, we have to model nature using quantum mechanical systems and not classical systems. So that's, I think, probably the most impactful and application which is going to come out even in the long term, and it will probably get started in the near term as well. As for the other applications, I said that there is sort of this negative application of code breaking. That, to my understanding, still requires a computer which is very powerful, and it's not going to be available in a very near future. I mean, I don't think even in 10 years we will have something which can break the current codes. But you never know. Things can accelerate quite rapidly. And in fact, that's the reason people are saying that you have to start planning ahead. How to replace your cryptographic systems to plan for eventual attacks from a quantum computer. There are other applications in logistics, and I think you had mentioned stock markets. It all comes down to modeling, right? So there is a general sort of understanding is that any calculation which involves looking at many, many different possibilities, a quantum computer can probably do well there because of this ability of superposition. So this is again a very hand-waving and a vague way, but that's sort of the general idea, is that if there is a problem which requires you to look at many, many different possibilities, and any system which is which is sensitive to small changes like the financial markets or even weather prediction for that matter, you have many different possibilities, and if you could somehow explore all the different possibilities efficiently, then you would do better. For a classical computer, it has to be sort of done in some serial fashion. You have to look at them one at a time, but a quantum computer might be able to. Okay, the trick is, what is that algorithm? And for many of these applications, it's not clear what that algorithm could be. We are sort of making some of these predictions based on what we already know about the existing quantum algorithms and saying that, okay, if this works like this, then this particular problem might be attacked well with the quantum computer. And people are starting to look at, even industry, I think that's where a lot of the industry is now starting to get involved, is trying to understand whether a quantum computer eventually, when it comes, can be used for these different applications. But if you ask my own favorite one, I think it's the modeling nature, because it just has a vast amount of application. It's just like you're now going to be able to do science at a whole different level, and with more information and more understanding, you can accelerate the output of all of these things.
So all of these could be simulated
more efficiently.
Yeah, wow.
Right.
Wow. Cool, lovely. So tell me, at this point in time, the biggest buzzword is artificial intelligence, right? It's the big thing. And there are some of these leaders who believe that machines could get sentient or conscious maybe in the next possibly couple of decades. Do you think there could be a convergence between a quantum computer and AI, and maybe that would help make a machine intelligent to like a human level intelligence? Do you see that a possibility?
So this is an area where I've myself not looked into a lot in terms of trying to think about AI or AI and quantum computer. But again, there are sort of two aspects of it. And I think recently I was listening to some interview by Vijay from Google.
Right.
And there are actually some of my colleagues who have been working on this recently. AI can help build quantum computers.
Yes.
Okay.
But would a narrow AI be able to build a quantum computer, or would a machine which is possibly like they say, which is like maybe a sentient machine, would be able to a much
well, to the best of my understanding, this idea of a sentient machine or a conscious machine, it's not necessary that it needs quantum mechanics.
Right. Okay.
It's not clear.
But do you think, I'm sorry for
entirely
interrupting.
possible.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. But do you think a cognitive structure, how we behave, do we behave classical in nature because everything is yes and no, or is it quantum mechanical?
We don't know.
Right.
So it depends on what question you're asking. How do the chemical reactions inside our body go about? Yes, that requires quantum behavior. In fact, they follow the law of quantum mechanics. It comes down to the question of the functioning of the brain. We already model artificial brains, and we were talking about this earlier.
Right.
By simulating neurons, we have a fairly good understanding of the structure of the brain. Now the question is, does the neuron need to be a quantum mechanical object, or is it just something which fires or doesn't fire? Now I'm probably saying something wrong here, but will it change or offer significantly new possibilities if the neuron could exist in a simultaneous superposition of firing and not firing at the same time? I'm imagining that would be the quantum extension of the current model. So this, I think, to the best of my knowledge, nobody really knows that whether our brain, in terms of its information processing capacity, is using classical computing laws or quantum computing laws. I think we like to believe that, we don't really understand because the brain seems to be fantastic at doing so many things. So it must be something complicated. Quantum mechanics, we don't understand, is complicated. So maybe brain and the quantum mechanics are somehow connected. I remember having this conversation with my PhD advisor many years ago, and it's not very obvious that you need not quantum mechanics, but quantum computing ideas to make a brain which works very well. Right? All the progress we have made in AI so far is without quantum computing. So it's possible that now, because AI again sort of, it learns by itself, it tries different things and learns by itself. Now you're basically putting the AI paradigm into a different world where the rules are different. And then you can say, the possibilities are endless, because the quantum already seems to offer many, many more possibilities in terms of trying different things out. So maybe the AI combined with the laws of quantum will allow you to do something even more dramatic. This is still to be seen. I don't think there are very clear answers yet. At least I have not looked into it myself. The other part is what people are doing, at least the work I'm aware of in using AI, is that AI can help you solve many problems.
Right.
And one of the problems we currently have is how to build a quantum computer, which is good.
Right.
So These will, of course, be, you have to define the particular problem, that
Right.
what you're trying to solve. Is it a particular technology within a quantum computer thing you're trying to solve, or is it some overall thing you're trying to, figure out? So those are sort of special cases. So there is really two different aspects.
Right.
AI helping to build us quantum computers, and then quantum computing ideas combined with the AI ideas allowing us to do something completely radically new, which we cannot even imagine right now.
Right. So I was Googling for quantum computing startups from India, and I came across maybe just one or two. Bhagwan Komadi claims to be one of the first quantum computing startup from India. So there are companies like Rigetti and IBM which are offering quantum computing on the cloud. And like you mentioned, there are present day use cases, right from the finance sector to various other possibilities. Why do you see the lack of Indian startups looking at these opportunities? Because these will eventually be extremely valuable if you start exploiting it from right now.
Yeah, sure. My own take is that startups will emerge in an environment where there is a lot of basic research
Right.
into that technology has already been done, and there's sort of an environment. But as you said, that some of these things are now available, through these international service providers. But these are still small scale
Right.
machines. To develop something which can then be marketed. At the end of the day, startups would like to make money and have a business model. It's not so easy yet, but I think the person whom you mentioned is somebody who's developing quantum algorithms.
Right.
There is also another startup which actually is in a slightly connected space in quantum cryptography. This is actually securing information using the ideas of quantum mechanics, and this is unbreakable, because it's protected by the laws of physics, at least to some extent. And I think this one is called QNew Labs.
Okay.
And that's not a quantum computing startup. And then you mentioned Rigetti. Rigetti, of course, is providing, what they call a full stack. So they're also developing the hardware. And if you want to have a startup here which is developing the hardware, you need people who are working and trained in this area. And we have, as I said, my own lab has started only 7 years ago. And my students will take some time before they come out and they decide that they want to start a company. So that time cycle is always going to be there, and especially hardware startups are, I think, difficult in India.
Right.
All the big startup boom is mostly in the IT, right? All software and IT solutions, because the setup is in place, the resources required in terms of computation, and it's not that hard to get, relatively speaking. And the business environment and the whole startup culture is starting there. But it's going to happen. In fact, there are even other areas which are related to peripheral technologies, because to develop a large-scale quantum computer, you're going to need a lot of very sophisticated electronics. Now, this technology is around, but you often need custom solutions so that they're cost-effective. So there are actually small startups in Europe and America which are trying to get into this space, where they'll say, hey, we're not going to build you a full quantum computer, but if you are building one, then we will try to help you with the relevant technology.
Right.
So all of this is going to happen. It's only a question of, are the people trained in the right areas? Are they connected with the right people who want to do this? And I think that is now happening in India. And there is, I don't know if you followed the news, but earlier this year, there was an announcement of the government actually going to launch these so-called national missions in many different areas, including AI. And one of them is the quantum, I think it's called the Quantum
Quest.
Frontier or something. Quest is a program which the Department of Science and Technology started 2 years ago. So that was slightly on a smaller scale, still pretty big from typical Indian programs. It's sort of, hopefully going to get started in terms of the funds being rolled out anytime now. It was launched, I think, about 2 years ago. The national mission was announced earlier this year, and that is a very big, all-encompassing program, which is going to include researchers from universities and institutes, is going to include stakeholders from the government agencies like DRDO and maybe the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology, MIT, and other people who have interest in this technology, and also from industry. So we are actually now in the process of having these meetings in different parts of the country where we are gathering input, we are talking to stakeholders. And then once this program is formulated, there will be a very special place and an important place for startups to come and plug into this ecosystem and start developing that. But it's not surprising that we don't have startups because the research itself has only started very recently. So it's going to take some time. But I think there's a lot of way to innovate there, especially in this peripheral technology space where because we have the talent, we have the good engineers here. If we can put them together and get them to focus on this particular area, we can actually do many things, which can even then be relevant on the international scale, where that we can develop a product which is so good that we can market it to everybody.
Right. Yeah, that would be nice.
Yeah.
That would be great. So tell me, I mean, if somebody wants to learn quantum computing, where does he go? Does India have curriculum or institutes which are offering any curriculum when it comes to quantum computing?
Yeah, absolutely. I think many institutes now have at least one or two courses on quantum computing at the undergraduate level itself. And again, quantum computing is actually very interdisciplinary. There is the algorithm side, which is all computer science, and that's typically taught in computer science departments. Then there is the hardware development, which is usually in the physics side. Now, because this whole research has only started fairly recently, there are not very structured courses for learning that. So it's happening at a small level. But as part of these new funding programs, the human resource development is also a very important part. And we are planning how to create new courses, make them available, maybe even like have remote lectures and basically a collection of resources for the Indian community itself. But otherwise, on the web, there's a lot of resources. The elementary requirements and the basics can be picked up from books with anybody, with up to say even a basic undergraduate degree in any field in physics or mathematics or computer science. Beyond that, you have to be plugged into a research environment. It's not something which is very easy to do on your own, but you have in the past people have shown that they have been able to do it. And algorithm development could be something where people could work almost by themselves after it's then really up to their own creativity and imaginative power on whether they can connect the new features available in quantum computing space and see the link between that and a particular application. I think that can be done by anybody, So in that sense, you don't really need any formal training. But, if you have to come and work in my lab, I expect a certain number of basic skills to be present. And then the rest is sort of on the job. You get trained in the lab and you work those things. So as the number of such people grows, and which will grow also as more funding comes in, that community will grow, and then more and more resources will also be available. But there's plenty of resources all around the world, free lectures. I get emails from students who almost all of them have taken this one popular lecture from a Berkeley professor through this EDX or one of those platforms. So those ideas are there, but to have the opportunity to implement them practically, those things are growing slowly. So it will take some more time, but I think the community is growing.
Right. So you've been doing this for the last 7 years. So
actually more 7 years here. yeah.
So what do you see for the future? Where do you see yourself in the next 7 years, and what do you think quantum computing is going to do to the world?
As I said a little while back, we don't know yet which particular technology might actually win out, right? So it's entirely possible there's a radical new technology around the corner and that will change the whole game. But what we need to do is fairly clear, right? We need to reduce the errors so that these computers can become more reliable.
Right.
And then we have to bring in this very important idea of error correction, which ensures that even if your individual qubits are not so perfect and they are giving errors, overall, it's in that some sense, it's vaguely related to the principle behind blockchain as well, even though I shouldn't really say it, but it's distributed information. So by distributing information amongst multiple qubits, you can still recover the information even if one of them or a few of them go bad. That's sort of very vaguely speaking the idea of error correction. That is extremely crucial. So the next big breakthrough in quantum computing will happen when we have error correction working.
Right.
So this has theoretically been shown to be a solid idea. It has experimentally been demonstrated at the level of proof of principle, but it has not reached the stage where we have said that, okay, here are a bunch of bad qubits, I put them together and now have a better qubit. We have not reached that. We have just barely crossed that threshold.
Right.
So once that happens, then the reliability of quantum computers will become much, much more. And then you can start doing more and more powerful things. And then, as I said earlier, you have to make the number of qubits larger. So that's sort of the steps which are required. And then as the computers become more powerful, in parallel, people are trying to invent new applications. And then those will start, actually becoming a reality. And it's actually an interesting time where producers have, like manufacturers are making not so great machines. End users are thinking, okay, what can I do with it? So everybody's working together. Like even the end user is sort of saying that, okay, fine, give me your bad computer. Let me see what I can do with it. And so it's sort of an interesting collaboration effort going on where the end user is also, sort of specifying some of the things and contributing in the process itself. So I think these things will happen one at a, slowly and in parallel. But we don't know which technology. Currently, there are these two approaches, as I said, superconducting devices and the ion trap technology, which are leading the race. But tomorrow we could have something completely new. In my own lab, I want to keep working on the superconducting device, even though I'm actually going to get into another technology very soon with the collaborator in IIT Bombay. My initial idea was also when I first started here, because I knew that we will not have massive resources to immediately start building something like a 50 or 100 qubit system. So I wanted to identify important problems which would make the fundamental building blocks better. Because if you can solve that, it immediately becomes relevant for everybody.
Right.
And that is something you can do, maybe not necessarily having a lot of resources. So of course, now as the funding situation improves, new programs come in, I have now a hand in both of these kind of projects. Looking at the very basic elements and saying that, can we just rethink this completely? Can we make a better design, which is just better on all respects? And at the same time, trying to learn and master the technology for scaling it up to larger and larger number of computers. Because if I want to get involved in running algorithms which are interesting, I need a larger computer before I can actually do something really useful. So now this is going to happen in parallel. So that's my own plan that, maybe in the next 5-7 years, we have, say, a 20 or a 50 qubit machine of our own. And then to be able to run some new interesting algorithms developed by us or by our colleagues here who are, going to start looking into these things, or, anywhere in the world, for example, for that matter.
Lovely. It was a pleasure talking to you, Vijay, and wish you the very best. And I hope that in the near future you have your 50 qubit or 100 qubit hopefully ready, because you never know. Technology is growing on an exponential space, because I'm sure you're looking at 50, possibly you'll get 200 qubit, or more, and do something transformational. So wish you the very best for it. Thank you for joining Change I Am Possible. Really appreciate
for having
it.
Me here.
Thank you. And if you like what you see, please press the subscribe button. What I'm going to do, like always, is leave the social links below of Mr. Vijayraghavan, so you can connect with him and figure collaboration, because this is the intention of this podcast is to create an ecosystem in a community where we grow the ecosystem. This technology is in such a nascent stage, but eventually I believe that quantum computing is going to be one of those technologies which is going to change the world dynamically. Yeah, so waiting for that future. And until next time, see you guys. Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.